The society pages promised a fairy tale wedding, a glorious union of American millions and British nobility. But behind the glittering facade lay a devastating $1 million scam. This is the story of Alice Thaw, a Gilded Age heiress with an unimaginable fortune, and the Earl of Yarmouth, a charming aristocrat with a hidden agenda. By the end, you will understand exactly how a dream marriage was systematically dismantled into one of history's most brazen financial cons. We will uncover the elaborate lies he told and the moment Alice's family realized the terrifying truth. What does true deception look like when it wears the mask of high society? Alice Cornelia Thaw was born into a world of almost unimaginable wealth. Her father, William Thaw, was a titan of Pittsburgh industry, a man who built a colossal fortune from the steel and railroads that were stitching America together. For Alice, this meant a life of pure privilege, surrounded by mansions, European tours, and the finest things money could buy. Yet this gilded cage came with a specific and heavy social burden. In the glittering ballrooms of New York, the ultimate prize for a young American heiress was not merely more money, but a title. Marrying into the European aristocracy was the final, dazzling step to cementing a family status, a transaction where new money traded cash for ancient lineage. Alice, with her vast inheritance, was one of the most sought-after players in this high-stakes game. But this very position made her uniquely vulnerable. Surrounded by suitors who coveted her fortune more than her person, how could she possibly distinguish genuine affection from a well-rehearsed performance? She was a perfect target, groomed by her society for a charming man who understood the rules of this cynical exchange all too well. Into this world of calculated romance stepped Marmaduke Constable Maxwell. He was a man whose very name sounded like it belonged in a history book, the heir to the ancient title of the Earl of Yarmouth. His aristocratic credentials were beyond reproach, tracing a lineage back through generations of English nobility. In the glittering social whirl of London and New York, he cut a dashing figure. He was charming, witty, and moved with an effortless grace that spoke of a life spent in drawing rooms and at court. For a society obsessed with bloodlines, he was the genuine article. Here was a man who offered the one thing American money could not manufacture, a coronet. He presented himself as the perfect solution to the Thaw family's social ambitions, a nobleman who could seamlessly integrate their vast new wealth into his old, respectable world. His conversations were laced with talk of his ancestral home, Townley Hall, a grand estate that he described in vivid, loving detail. He spoke of restoring its former glory, of filling its halls with art and life once more. It was a romantic vision, one specifically tailored to appeal to a family eager to see their fortune ennobled by a grand, historic purpose. How could anyone suspect that this polished gentleman, with his impeccable manners and his ancient title, was constructing an elaborate fantasy, one where Alice's inheritance was not just a welcome addition, but the entire point of the performance? The romance between Alice Thaw and the Earl of Yarmouth unfolded with the speed and intensity of a society column fantasy. Their meetings were a blur of glittering events, from opulent London balls to intimate suppers in New York. Each encounter meticulously chronicled by a press hungry for a real-life fairy tale. Marmaduke was the picture of an ardent suitor, showering Alice with extravagant tokens of his affection, He presented her with rare jewels and whispered promises of a life fit for a countess, all under the approving gaze of the public and her own family. The entire courtship was compressed into a matter of months, a whirlwind so thrilling that its velocity itself seemed like proof of passion, not a potential warning. In the dazzling haze of his attention and the relentless cheerleading of the newspapers, who would dare to question the pace? The sheer public nature of it all acted as a kind of social pressure, making any private doubt feel like a betrayal of the beautiful story everyone was so eager to believe. The engagement was announced to great fanfare, a union that seemed to validate the entire Gilded Age dream. But this rapid public procession toward the altar left no quiet moments for scrutiny, no time to look past the dazzling performance and ask the simple, dangerous question: what was truly fueling this nobleman's hurry? When the engagement was officially announced, it created a transatlantic sensation. Newspapers in New York trumpeted the news as a triumph of American enterprise, the glorious culmination of the Gilded Age dream. Alice Thaw was not just a bride, she was a national symbol, proof that New World wealth could purchase Old World prestige. Across the ocean, however, the reaction within British aristocratic circles was far more reserved, even skeptical. While the financial necessity for such unions was widely understood, many among the landed gentry viewed the marriage of an earl to a Pittsburgh steel heiress with a quiet disdain, seeing it not as a romantic union, but as a purely commercial transaction. This underlying tension was perfectly mirrored in the private negotiations now taking place behind closed doors. While the public celebrated a fairy tale, lawyers for the Thaw family and the Earl of Yarmouth were locked in intense discussions over the marriage settlement. These were not romantic conversations. They were complex legal and financial instruments designed to protect Alice's colossal inheritance. The pre-nuptial agreements detailed immense financial settlements, specifying vast sums of money and property that would be transferred to Marmaduke upon the marriage. For the Thaw family, these settlements were a necessary, if distasteful, part of the bargain, the price of securing a title for their daughter. For the Earl, these negotiations were the final hurdle, the moment where the promise of wealth was to be legally codified. The stage was now set, not for a wedding, but for a profound and costly conflict, where the very documents meant to ensure security would become the blueprint for betrayal. The wedding preparations escalated into a transatlantic spectacle of almost unimaginable luxury. The ceremony was to be held at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue, the most fashionable Episcopal church in New York, a venue befitting the union of a steel fortune and an earldom. The guest list read like a directory of American high society, with invitations sent to the most prominent Vanderbilts, Astors, and Rockefellers, all eager to witness this coronation of new money with old blood. For the wedding gown, Alice turned to the House of Worth in Paris, the undisputed master of haute couture, commissioning a creation that promised to be a work of art in silk and lace. Preliminary reports whispered of a cost running into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, a sum that would equate to many millions today. Every detail was meticulously planned and breathlessly reported, feeding a public hungry for every glittering morsel of the story. This was not merely a wedding, it was a cultural event, a powerful symbol of an era where American industrial might could purchase a slice of European aristocratic grandeur. The entire nation, it seemed, was holding its breath for the glorious day. Yet this mountain of anticipation, built so high on a foundation of public adoration and staggering expense, made the distance of the eventual fall not just dramatic, but catastrophic. How could such a brilliantly lit stage possibly prepare for the darkness that was waiting in the wings? The morning of the wedding dawned brilliantly over New York, a perfect day for a perfect ceremony. St. Thomas Church was transformed into a bower of opulence, filled with exotic orchids and the heady scent of thousands of roses. The pews were a sea of silk, satin, and the most extravagant hats money could buy, as the cream of American society gathered to witness the event they had all been reading about for months. When Alice Thaw walked down the aisle, she was a vision in her Parisian gown, a masterpiece of intricate lace and shimmering silk that seemed to capture all the light in the room. The Earl of Yarmouth stood at the altar, every inch the noble bridegroom, his posture impeccable, his expression one of solemn pride. To the envious onlookers and the busy reporters, it was the flawless culmination of a gilded age dream, a tableau of absolute success. Yet for those watching more closely, there were cracks in the magnificent facade. A keen observer might have noticed the slight, fixed quality of Alice's smile, a look not of radiant joy, but of determined composure. They might have seen the way the Earl's gaze seemed to drift over the congregation, as if surveying an asset rather than embracing a family. In a quiet moment before the vows, a brief, hushed exchange between the Thaw family lawyer and the groom was observed, their faces tight, their words sharp and hurried before they both forced smiles for the approaching photographer. The ceremony proceeded without a hitch. The reception was a feast of unparalleled luxury, and the society pages would later declare it the wedding of the season. But the splendor was a performance, a magnificent stage play where the actors were already beginning to forget their lines, and the most important scene was happening not in the spotlight, but in the tense whispers just offstage. The newlyweds departed for Europe amidst a blizzard of rice and good wishes, their grand tour designed to be a continuous pageant of luxury. They traveled as a countess and an earl should, staying in the finest suites of Parisian palaces and Italian villas, their every whim catered to by a small army of servants. Yet almost from the moment they left New York, the dynamic of their relationship began to shift in a way that must have chilled Alice to her core. The charming, attentive suitor was gone, replaced by a man with an insatiable appetite for spending. Marmaduke began to make extravagant purchases with a startling sense of entitlement, buying rare artworks, bespoke motor cars, and staggering amounts of jewelry, all on the premise of Alice's limitless fortune. The bills, of course, were sent directly to the Thaw family's lawyers in Pittsburgh. At first, these might have been dismissed as the exuberant spending of a wealthy aristocrat, but the pattern quickly grew more alarming. He began to make direct and increasingly forceful demands for immediate access to the vast sums promised in the marriage settlement. His demeanor in private could turn cold and imperious if Alice questioned a particular expense, his charm reappearing only when it was time to placate her or present a united front to others. The honeymoon was revealing itself not as a romantic idyll, but as a financial siege, where the Earl was testing the fortifications around the Thaw fortune, probing for any weakness he could exploit. How long could the glittering facade of the perfect marriage hold when the man at its center saw his bride not as a partner, but as a walking bank vault? Behind the polished facade of the Earl of Yarmouth lay a man drowning in debt. His aristocratic name and ancient title were assets he had learned to leverage with ruthless precision, masking a financial desperation that was, in fact, an open secret among the more discerning members of the British upper class. While the Thaw family saw a nobleman, those in his own circles knew him as a notorious fortune hunter, a man whose primary occupation was the pursuit of wealthy heiresses to replenish his family's depleted coffers. His genteel poverty was a powerful motivator, driving him to present a carefully curated version of himself to the world, one entirely devoid of financial worry. He had perfected the art of living on credit, charming tailors, hoteliers, and jewelers into extending him vast lines of credit based solely on the promise of his future wife's fortune. His gambling habits were equally reckless, fueling a cycle of loss that only increased his desperation. To Alice and her family, he spun a web of elaborate lies, assuring them that his own finances were stable, that his ancestral estate, Townley Hall, merely needed some modest investment to be restored. He presented the marriage not as a rescue mission for himself, but as a joint venture into a glorious future. In reality, every romantic gesture, every whispered promise, was a calculated move in a long con game. The charming suitor was a phantom, a character played by a man who saw Alice not as a person, but as the solution to every single one of his mounting problems. How could a young woman, raised in a world of privilege and protected from such harsh realities, possibly have seen the truth behind the title? The demand arrived not with a whisper, but with the force of a legal decree. Shortly after their return from the honeymoon tour, the Earl of Yarmouth presented the Thaw family with a formal, itemized request for funds that would equate to well over $1 million in today's currency. The sheer scale of the sum was breathtaking, a figure that could have supported a modest royal household for years. His pretext was a masterful blend of aristocratic obligation and emotional blackmail. He claimed the money was urgently required to settle long-standing debts on his ancestral estate, Townley Hall. Debts, he insisted, were a matter of family honor that needed immediate resolution now that he was a married man. He spoke of essential investments to modernize the estate's farms and mines, promising these outlays would generate future income for him and Alice, securing their legacy. And woven throughout his justification was a constant, subtle refrain: the need for living expenses befitting his rank and her fortune. He argued that a man of his station, married to an heiress of her renown, simply could not be seen to economize. To refuse him, he implied, would be to publicly humiliate them both, to admit that the glittering facade of their marriage was a sham. This was not the desperate plea of a man in trouble, but the calculated, bold strike of a con artist who believed he had already won. He had married the heiress. The world had celebrated their union, and now he was simply calling in the prize. The Thaw family, however, had finally reached their limit. This colossal demand was the flashpoint, the moment the polite fiction of the marriage shattered completely, forcing them to look past the title and finally see the man for what he was. The sheer audacity of the Earl's demand finally shattered the illusion. For Alice, the fog of romantic fantasy lifted in a single, chilling moment of clarity. The constant spending, the shifting excuses, the coldness when money was questioned, all coalesced into one terrifying truth. She was not loved. She was being financially dismantled. Her distress was immediate and profound, a private devastation that she quickly conveyed to her parents. In the Thaw mansion, the reaction was one of cold fury. William Thaw, the industrial titan who had built his fortune through shrewd calculation and relentless effort, now saw his daughter's life being systematically plundered by a man he had welcomed as a son-in-law. This was not a simple matter of a profligate husband. It was a premeditated assault on the family's legacy. Thaw's paternal instinct to protect his daughter collided with his business acumen, which recognized a sophisticated con artist. He immediately mobilized his legal team, a formidable force accustomed to battling corporate rivals, not English noblemen. Their investigation began quietly but urgently, a race to uncover the full scope of the Earl's deception before more of Alice's inheritance could vanish. Alice was now caught in an impossible trap, legally bound to a man who viewed her as his greatest financial asset. Her personal happiness sacrificed on the altar of a title that had proven to be utterly worthless. How do you escape a gilded cage when the lock is a wedding ring, and the entire world is still watching the performance? The Thaw family's response was swift and legally merciless. They did not simply file for divorce. They launched a full-scale legal assault by petitioning for an annulment. This was a critical distinction with profound implications. A divorce would have legally ended a valid marriage, but an annulment would declare that a valid marriage had never existed in the first place. The Thaw legal team argued that the Earl of Yarmouth had entered into the union under utterly false pretenses. His entire courtship, they claimed, was an elaborate fraud, a performance designed solely to get his hands on Alice's fortune. He had concealed his staggering debts, misrepresented his financial situation, and hidden his true motive, which was not love but financial rescue. If they could prove this in a court of law, the marriage could be erased as if it had never happened. Proving such fraud, however, was a monumental challenge. The court would need to be convinced that Marmaduke's deceit was so fundamental that it struck at the very heart of the marriage contract itself. It wasn't enough to show he was a spendthrift or a disappointing husband. They had to demonstrate that Alice would never have consented to marry him had she known the truth about his finances and his intentions. The case was poised to become a public spectacle, dragging the most intimate details of a high society fairy tale into the harsh light of a courtroom. The world was about to get a front row seat to the unraveling of a gilded myth, and the testimony promised to be explosive. How do you prove a man's heart was a forgery when all the world saw was a perfect gentleman? The scandal detonated across the front pages with the force of a bomb. From Pittsburgh to London, newspapers screamed with variations of the same shocking headline, "The Thaw Yarmouth Swindle." The story had everything: unimaginable wealth, a noble title, and a breathtaking betrayal. In America, the press framed the annulment suit as a dramatic showdown between honest industrial millions and decadent European aristocracy. Reporters painted Alice as both a tragic victim, a naive American girl duped by a titled fortune hunter, and a symbol of resilient new money fighting back against old world corruption. Editorial cartoons depicted the Earl as a grinning wolf in ermine robes, his pockets overflowing with dollar bills. Across the Atlantic, the British press was more circumspect, but no less captivated. Many publications took a thinly veiled delight in the Earl's disgrace, portraying him as a disgrace to his class, whose greed had brought shame upon the entire peerage. Yet they also subtly criticized the American system that created such heiresses and the naive families so desperate for a title that they ignored the obvious risks. The court of public opinion was now in session, and the verdict was being rendered not with gavels, but with ink and newsprint. For Alice, this media storm was a fresh kind of torment. Her private humiliation was now a global spectacle, her name forever linked to one of the greatest society scandals of the Gilded Age. Every detail of the alleged fraud, every accusation from the annulment papers, was reprinted and dissected for a voracious public. The Earl of Yarmouth found his own reputation in tatters. The very title he had used as his primary asset was now synonymous with treachery and debt. He became a social pariah in the clubs of London, a living cautionary tale about the dangers of a con game gone wrong. The glittering world that had so eagerly celebrated their union now feasted on its spectacular collapse, proving that in the high society of two continents, there was no entertainment quite like the fall of the mighty. Inside the hushed and wood-paneled courtroom, the Earl's carefully constructed world began to crumble. The Thaw family's legal team presented their case with the cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel, systematically exposing the architecture of his deception. They introduced a series of financial documents the Earl had provided before the wedding, statements that purported to show his estates were solvent and profitable. One by one, these papers were revealed to be complete fabrications, forgeries designed to portray a financial stability that had never existed. Bankers and London solicitors took the stand, their testimony painting a starkly different picture of the man seated at the defendant's table. They spoke of immense, long-standing debts, of creditors hounding him for years, and of a reputation within British financial circles as a hopelessly insolvent nobleman. The most damning evidence, however, came from the Earl's own mouth. Under relentless cross-examination, he was forced to contradict his own previous statements. He could not explain the discrepancies in his accounts, and his excuses for the forged documents shifted and collapsed under the weight of simple, factual questions. His aristocratic composure, once his greatest asset, began to fray, revealing flashes of irritation and evasion. Each exposed lie was another brick removed from the facade of the honorable gentleman, until all that remained was the undeniable image of a desperate fortune hunter. The courtroom became a theater of truth, and the star performer was losing his audience forever. How could such an elaborate persona, built over a lifetime, disintegrate so completely under the glare of honest inquiry? Faced with the mountain of evidence against him, the Earl of Yarmouth did not retreat. Instead, he mounted a defense of breathtaking arrogance, a performance that revealed the depth of his entitlement. He took the stand not as a penitent man, but as a nobleman grievously wronged by his new in-laws. He admitted to no wrongdoing, offering instead a portrait of Alice as a spoiled and hysterical young woman, utterly incapable of understanding the financial obligations of her new station. He claimed her family's refusal to hand over the promised millions was a breach of contract, a vulgar reneging on a business deal they had willingly entered. In his telling, the Thaws were social climbers who had gotten cold feet, attempting to back out of the very arrangement they had so eagerly pursued. He painted himself as the victim of American provincialism, a man of ancient lineage being haggled with by crude industrialists who did not comprehend the costs of upholding a noble house. His tone was one of wounded pride, suggesting that the real fraud was not his courtship, but the Thaw family's failure to deliver the financial fuel required to power his aristocratic life. It was a stunning inversion of reality, an attempt to frame the systematic plunder of a young woman's fortune as nothing more than a gentleman collecting his due. This was not a man apologizing for a con, but a con artist angrily demanding his payoff. How could such a brazen performance possibly hold up against the cold, hard facts of his forged documents and sworn testimony from his creditors? The courtroom victory provided legal freedom, but it could not erase the profound personal devastation Alice Thaw carried with her. Emerging from the ruins of her marriage, she was a changed woman, her youthful trust replaced by a deep and abiding wariness. The scandal clung to her like a shadow, transforming her status from a celebrated society bride into a permanent object of public fascination and pity. In the drawing rooms of New York and Newport, she found herself confronted by a different kind of cruelty than her ex-husband's, the subtle, cutting whispers and the awkward silences that fell when she entered a room. The very society that had once cheered her ascent now seemed to view her as a cautionary tale made flesh. She did not retreat entirely from public life, but her appearances became more selective, her circle of confidantes dramatically smaller. She developed a quiet dignity, a protective shell that shielded her from further injury, but it was a defense born of immense pain. The fairy tale had not just ended, it had been exposed as a fraudulent lie, and Alice was left to navigate a world where she could no longer trust the most fundamental promises. How does one learn to live again after the very foundation of their life has been proven to be a carefully constructed trap? Her fortune was largely intact, saved by her father's legal intervention, but her innocence was gone forever, a price no amount of money could ever refund. In the years that followed, Alice sought a different kind of life, one defined by quiet purpose rather than public spectacle. She never remarried, a decision that spoke volumes about the lasting trauma of her experience. The institution of marriage itself had been so thoroughly corrupted by the Earl's deception that she likely found the prospect of trusting another suitor an impossible task. Instead, she channeled her energy and her considerable wealth into philanthropy, becoming a significant but quiet benefactor of various charitable causes, particularly those related to children and education. She divided her time between a more subdued existence in New York and extended travels abroad, always avoiding the glittering social whirl that had once defined her. While she never fully escaped the notoriety of the Yarmouth case, she managed to carve out a life of meaning on her own terms, a private victory of resilience over betrayal. Her story stands as a stark reminder of the human cost behind the glittering headlines of Gilded Age heiress scandals. The $1 million scam was more than a financial loss. It was a theft of trust, a shattering of personal security that echoed for the rest of her days. The con artist moved on, but the victim was left to spend a lifetime rebuilding the pieces. For the Earl of Yarmouth, the annulment was a catastrophic defeat, stripping him of the one asset he had worked so hard to acquire, the Thaw fortune. While Alice faced a lifetime of personal healing, Marmaduke confronted a very public and swift financial execution. The annulment meant he received nothing from the marriage settlement, and now his towering debts, no longer placated by the promise of future millions, came crashing down upon him. Creditors who had once been patient, hoping to be paid from the Thaw coffers, now descended with lawsuits of their own. His credit, which had been extended on the fragile basis of his impending wedding, evaporated completely. Within a remarkably short time, he was declared bankrupt, his financial reputation in utter ruins. The man who had schemed for $1 million was left with less than nothing, his title now a hollow shell attached to a mountain of unpaid bills. But was financial ruin the only consequence for such a public deception? The legal system of the time offered little recourse for what was, in the eyes of the law, a personal betrayal rather than a clear-cut crime. He faced no criminal charges for his forged documents or his fraudulent courtship. The annulment was the extent of his legal punishment, a bitter irony that left him free, but utterly broken. His social standing suffered an even more complete collapse. In the clubs of London and the country houses of England, he became a permanent pariah. The very aristocracy he had claimed to represent now shut its doors to him, viewing his failed scheme not as a misfortune, but as a disgraceful act that brought shame upon their entire class. He was the living embodiment of a cautionary tale, a warning to other fortune hunters about the risks of a con executed too brazenly. So what becomes of a man who has gambled his entire identity and lost? Marmaduke Constable Maxwell, the once dashing Earl of Yarmouth, spent his remaining years in obscurity and relative poverty. He drifted through life on the fringes of society, a ghost at the feast he had once aimed to conquer, his grand ambitions reduced to a mere footnote in the chronicle of Gilded Age scandal. His ultimate fate serves as a stark counterpoint to Alice's quiet resilience, a reminder that while financial and social ruin can be devastating, the loss of one's very honor is a sentence from which there is no appeal. The Thaw family's crusade did not end with the gavel's fall in the annulment court. William Thaw, a man who had built an empire on iron and resolve, now wielded his wealth as a weapon of retribution. He understood that while the law could sever the marital bond, it could not fully erase the social stain or guarantee the Earl would not attempt such a scheme again. Behind the scenes, the family used their vast financial and social influence to systematically isolate Marmaduke Constable Maxwell. They made it quietly known to their business contacts, their banking associates, and their powerful friends on both sides of the Atlantic that any person or institution who continued to extend credit or social courtesy to the disgraced Earl would be doing so at the expense of their relationship with the Thaw fortune. This was not a public campaign, but a silent, powerful squeeze, effectively blacklisting him from the very circles where he needed to operate. The message was unmistakable. The Thaws were closing ranks, and their protection of Alice was absolute. This brutal lesson in the power of industrial money over aristocratic title fundamentally reshaped the family's world view. Their brief, disastrous foray into the European nobility had cured them of any lingering fascination with titles. The grand ambition of merging new money with old blood was exposed as a dangerous fantasy. From that point forward, the management of the Thaw fortune became more insular, more guarded, with prenuptial agreements and financial controls becoming even more rigorous for any future suitors, American or otherwise. The $1 million scam had taught them that their greatest asset was also their greatest vulnerability, and they would never again let a charming mask disguise a calculated predator. Alice Thaw's shattered fairy tale sent a shockwave through the parlors of Newport and the ballrooms of London. Her story became far more than a personal tragedy. It crystallized into a potent cautionary tale for every American family with a fortune and a daughter. The Gilded Age rush for titles had always carried an element of risk, a whispered understanding that one might be trading cash for coldness. But the Yarmouth case exposed that risk as something far more sinister, a systematic con game where the ultimate price was not just money, but a young woman's entire emotional and psychological well-being. The scandal forced a moment of collective introspection. Was a coronet truly worth the danger of handing your cherished daughter over to a charming, well-bred stranger whose primary qualification was a depleted bank account and an ancient name? The answer, for many, began to shift from a hopeful yes to a cautious no. Families who had once viewed prenuptial agreements as a mere formality, a dry legal necessity, now saw them as the first and most vital line of defense. The Thaw case demonstrated with brutal clarity that these documents needed to be ironclad, scrutinized not just by lawyers, but by financial detectives. The focus shifted from simply outlining the transfer of wealth to building in powerful safeguards against fraud. Provisions for full, audited financial disclosure from the titled suitor became paramount. Clauses were added that could void the entire settlement if any material misrepresentation was discovered, exactly as the Earl had done. These were no longer just contracts. They were fortifications designed to prevent another Alice from being lured into a gilded trap. The romantic dream began to be tempered by a new, hard-nosed pragmatism, where a man's financial records became as important as his lineage. The very nature of the transatlantic marriage market began to change. The naive whirlwind courtship that had characterized Alice's engagement started to look less like a romance and more like a red flag. Families became more deliberate, insisting on longer engagements that allowed for deeper investigation into a suitor's background, his habits, and his true financial standing within his own country. The eager, unquestioning press coverage that had once fueled these unions was now met with more skepticism. A handsome earl with a grand estate was no longer taken at face value. He was vetted with the same ruthless diligence one would apply to a business merger. The era of the naive dollar princess, swept off her feet by a title, was drawing to a close. In its place emerged a more guarded generation of heiresses, raised on the story of Alice Thaw and taught to look past the glittering surface to the potential emptiness beneath. The price of a title remained high, but after the Yarmouth scandal, families were finally beginning to understand that the greatest cost might not be in dollars and cents, but in a broken spirit that no fortune could ever repair. This psychological blueprint for deception was rooted in a profound and twisted sense of entitlement. Men like the Earl of Yarmouth were raised with the unshakable belief that their ancient lineage and titles granted them a natural right to a life of luxury and leisure, regardless of their actual financial means. Their very identity was built upon centuries of inherited privilege, a story they told themselves that justified any action to maintain that status. In their minds, the pursuit of an heiress was not a desperate grab for cash. It was a reclamation of their birthright. They saw the vast fortunes of American industrialists as a New World resource, rightfully destined to fund the preservation of Old World grandeur. This internal narrative transformed their predatory behavior into a noble mission, allowing them to view their targets not as human beings with feelings, but as instruments of their own salvation. How else could a man look a woman in the eye, vow to love and cherish her, all while meticulously planning the systematic transfer of her fortune into his own empty coffers? This was not the mindset of a common thief, but of an aristocrat who believed the world owed him a debt, and he was merely collecting it through the most convenient channel available. The sheer audacity of the scam was fueled by this unshakable conviction that he was not stealing, but restoring a natural order that had been temporarily disrupted by his family's insolvency. The legal fortress protecting an heiress was built long before she ever walked down the aisle. For dynasties like the Thaws, a daughter's marriage was less a romantic union and more a high-stakes corporate merger, demanding ironclad contracts to shield the family's industrial wealth. The primary instrument for this protection was the marriage settlement, a complex legal document far more detailed than a modern prenuptial agreement. These settlements were not about preventing divorce, which was a social catastrophe, but about controlling the flow of capital. A typical settlement would place the bride's fortune into a trust, managed by a board of trustees appointed by her father. The income from this trust, a generous annual allowance, would be provided to the husband for the couple's living expenses, but the principal, the colossal fortune itself, remained legally out of his reach. It was designated for the future children of the marriage, ensuring the money stayed within the bloodline. This system created a frustrating reality for fortune hunters. A man could marry the heiress and live comfortably on the interest, but he could never actually touch the golden goose. The Thaw family thought their settlement was a masterpiece of defensive planning, a legal labyrinth no suitor could navigate. Yet the Earl of Yarmouth's entire scheme was a direct assault on these very walls. His demand for a massive, immediate lump sum was a blatant attempt to bypass the trust entirely, to get his hands on the principle that the documents were specifically designed to protect. His actions proved that even the most carefully drafted contract was only as strong as the character of the man signing it, a terrifying vulnerability that sent wealthy families back to their lawyers in a panic. How could you write a clause to protect against a heart that was itself a forgery? The relentless churn of the printing presses gave the scandal its terrifying power. In the Gilded Age, newspapers were not mere observers. They were active participants, architects of public opinion with the power to crown royalty one day and stage an execution the next. For the Thaw family, this formidable machine became a double-edged sword. Initially, the press had built the gilded cage, breathlessly reporting every detail of Alice's courtship and wedding, creating a mountain of public expectation that made any retreat impossible. But once the betrayal was revealed, the Thaws learned to wield that very same power as a weapon. They strategically leaked details of the annulment suit to sympathetic reporters, ensuring the story broke on their terms. The narrative they crafted was potent and simple. The honest American family, guardians of hard-earned industrial wealth, versus the decadent, duplicitous European aristocrat. This was not just about airing dirty laundry. It was a calculated campaign of public shaming, designed to strip the Earl of Yarmouth of his most valuable asset after the money, his social standing. The front pages became their courtroom in the public, their jury. How do you fight a man whose entire life is a performance? You turn on the lights for the entire audience to see. The Earl found himself trapped in a spotlight of his own making, his every denial and excuse dissected and mocked in ink. The same society columns that had once celebrated his lineage now printed the humiliating testimony of his creditors and the cold, hard facts of his forgeries. This media firestorm served a crucial purpose for the Thaws. It created a wall of public outrage that made it politically and socially impossible for any powerful friends to come to the Earl's defense. In an era without social media, the newspaper was the ultimate arbiter of reputation, and the Thaws proved they knew how to make it work for them. The very institution that had helped lure Alice into the trap was now the primary instrument for her family's brutal public revenge. The Thaw-Yarmouth scandal did not simply fade from the headlines. It seeped into the very foundations of high society, permanently altering the landscape of transatlantic matchmaking. In the grand ballrooms of New York, a palpable chill descended upon the once feverish pursuit of a title. The romantic veneer was stripped away, revealing the transaction for what it had always been, a perilous gamble. American heiresses were no longer seen as fairy tale princesses in waiting, but as potential targets. Their families, once eager to trade cash for coronets, now approached British nobility with the wary skepticism of corporate raiders assessing a risky acquisition. The question was no longer how grand an estate a suitor possessed, but how deep his debts ran. This new caution gave rise to a novel profession, the discreet private investigator, hired to cross the Atlantic and verify the true state of a lord's finances and his character, a direct consequence of the $1 million lesson learned from Alice's ordeal. The fervor for Anglo-American marriages did not disappear overnight, but it was forever tempered by a hard-edged pragmatism. The age of the naive whirlwind courtship was effectively over. How could anyone look at a charming Earl the same way again, knowing the ruin that might lie behind his polished smile? In London, the scandal forced a painful moment of reckoning within the aristocracy itself. The Earl of Yarmouth's brazenness had exposed a dirty secret many preferred to keep hidden: the fact that some of their most esteemed names were being propped up by American dollars. He became a pariah not merely for his failure, but for his clumsiness, for making the entire system look grubby and desperate. The old guard viewed him with contempt, a man who had disgraced his class by getting caught. For the American moneyed class, this shift in perception was profound. The aristocracy lost its mystique, its aura of inherent superiority. A title was no longer a golden ticket to social nirvana. It was now a potential liability, a badge that could just as easily signify financial desperation as ancient honor. The dynamic of power subtly but irrevocably tilted. American fathers, who had once felt a sense of social inferiority in the presence of a duke, now held the upper hand, their wealth scrutinizing an aristocrat's pedigree for hidden flaws. The transaction became less about social climbing and more about a cold-eyed assessment of what each party truly brought to the table. The gilded cage had been unlocked, not by the key of a title, but by the stark realization that sometimes the most dangerous predators wear the finest robes. Even after the courtroom drama faded, the full scope of the Earl's deception remained shrouded in shadow. We know the devastating impact he had on Alice Thaw, but a haunting question lingers: was she his only target? The historical record hints at other potential victims, wealthy women whose families, unlike the Thaws, may have chosen silence over the scandal of a public trial. The Earl moved in the same rarefied social circles for years before he met Alice, a charming and perpetually cash-strapped nobleman on the prowl. It is entirely plausible that other brief engagements or intense courtships were quietly dissolved when financial demands became too pressing, the truth buried to protect other reputations. The con artist's playbook relies on multiple attempts, and the sheer audacity of his scheme against the Thaws suggests a man who had refined his techniques over time. Who else might have narrowly escaped his gilded trap? We are also left to wonder about Alice's own voice in the decades that followed. She lived a long and largely private life after the annulment, but did she ever break her silence? Did she confide in a private diary, or perhaps in letters to a trusted friend, recounting the full emotional toll of that disastrous year? No such documents have ever surfaced publicly. Her story is told through court transcripts and newspaper accounts, the loud voices of lawyers and journalists. The quiet, personal reflection of the woman who lived through it all remains a mystery. What would she have said about the man who courted her? How did she process the betrayal, not just as a wealthy heiress, but as a young woman whose trust was so utterly violated? The absence of her own words leaves a profound gap in our understanding, reducing a deeply personal trauma to a historical footnote. This lack of a first-hand account fuels the search for new evidence. Could there be a forgotten trunk of letters in an attic somewhere, or a sealed family archive holding the missing pieces? Historians continue to sift through the papers of other Gilded Age families, hoping to find a passing reference, a whispered warning, or a candid observation that sheds new light on the Earl's methods or Alice's state of mind. Every uncovered document has the potential to shift our perspective, to transform the villain and the victim from archetypes into more complex, fully realized people. The story of Alice Thaw and the Earl of Yarmouth feels complete, yet it remains tantalizingly open-ended, a century-old scandal that still guards its most intimate secrets. What truth remains hidden, waiting to be found? The story of Alice Thaw and the Earl of Yarmouth stands as the ultimate Gilded Age cautionary tale, a dramatic arc that soared on the wings of social ambition before crashing into the hard ground of financial reality. It was a saga that perfectly encapsulated the era's central conflict, the desperate clash between ancient titles hungry for cash and new fortunes starving for prestige. In the end, the narrative was not about love or legacy, but about the sheer, brutal power of deception. Alice's vulnerability did not come from her gender or her youth alone, but from a society that had conditioned her and her family to see a noble title as the highest possible achievement, a prize worth any risk. That collective ambition became the very weapon used against them. The con worked because everyone involved wanted so desperately to believe in the fairy tale. This particular $1 million scam, with its forged documents and calculated romance, reveals a timeless truth about human nature. The desire for social elevation can create a blindness that the most cunning predators are uniquely equipped to exploit. The gilded traps of one era may look different from those of another, but the fundamental vulnerabilities remain the same. What other infamous historical cons have captured your attention? Share the stories of deception and daring that you find most compelling in the comments below.